This is a short film introducing the collection of the Bachelor Pad Museum. Such a film is necessary in part because the Bachelor Pad Museum is not an entirely typical house museum. Its inhabitant is alive and changing, and its boundaries do not correspond exactly to the walls that house it. Indeed, while the collection could be said to exist within two main boundaries, those of the Bachelor Pad and of the Bachelor's body, the purpose of this film is to show that such boundaries are porous and provisional. They admit and excrete items which remain part of the collection but could not feasibly be contained within the given barriers. If you like, you could think of this film as the museum's archive or storage unit. Much of the Bachelor's collection is taken from books, films, and other house museums. When you see this symbol, that means the film is directly quoting or citing someone else's work, making their work part of the collection. When you see this symbol, that indicates that what is shown on screen was collected in another house museum. The ethos of the collection in general is citation and conversation rather than ownership. Sometimes when the Bachelor looks at himself, he is alarmed to see that he is disintegrating. Holes form in his white skin, through which clear and off-white substances leak and ooze. At times, these holes manifest more violently as slits. At other times, and in other places, there are no discrete holes, but the whole surface of the skin rises to a tender and irritated pinky red. Sometimes there is not much pain, but patches of the skin seem to be falling off in tetchy flakes. This all happens in cycles, migrating patches of different forms of vulnerability and discomfort across his whole body. When it strikes some parts, it feels like some kind of pollution is finding its way to the surface from deep inside. And when it strikes others, it feels like some of the dirt and mess of the world is attacking from the outside. Neither the Bachelor's doctor nor his independent internet research give a clear answer to whether the cause of the irritation is primarily internal or external. They don't even seem interested in the question. The problem is not something pushing on the boundary from the inside or the outside. The problem is the boundary itself. To have a plan is to have had ideas. This is what the dude himself says. What are those ideas? There is a famous Eileen Gray drawing showing routes of circulation around E1027. It is designed from the inside out, working from intimate function rather than form. The Bachelor loves it for the attention it pays to the reality of the body. And yet he notices that all the paths are orthogonal. Gray never shows someone drunkenly stumbling in the dark, or walking diagonally across a room, then stopping halfway because they forgot what they were going for. She appears to always know what the inhabitant of the house she designs will want. Moving along orthogonal paths in modernist houses, the Bachelor performs someone else's desires. For an architect, to have a plan is to have had ideas. When the Bachelor moves through an architect-designed house museum, he moves first of all to the century-old rhythm of someone else's ideas of how one should live. He doesn't object to this in itself. His own body, any body in any space, has the capacity to bristle against a designer's intentions. What is codified in the walls, in the plan of the house itself, can be in a fruitfully antagonistic relationship with his own agency. But the institutions managing these houses often have other plans. Is she leaving the Shonnery? I think she is. Must mean it's nearly time for me to leave as well. I wonder where the actual boundary is. The audio tour of the Rietveld-Schroeder house maintains a sense of ambiguity around the relationship between its two namesakes. It tells the love story as well as a museum tour can be expected to tell a love story. The audio tour, and the information in the next door visitor centre, give the Bachelor a reasonable idea of how Truth Schroeder moved through her house on a normal day. They give a chronological rundown of which periods Gerrit Rietveld lived and worked there with her, and which he spent living with his wife and children. Because the inhabitants don't occupy stable roles in relation to domestic architecture, something profound about the contours of their life remains inaccessible. The Bachelor is pleased with this ambiguity, this inaccessibility. He enjoys the thought of moving as if through a haunted house, torn between unravelling the mystery and respectfully leaving it in place. He enjoys imagining the disparity of his movements with theirs, lingering in strange spots and uncovering his own paths. This lingering turns out to be a fantasy. An entrance ticket only entitles him to spend an hour in the house. The tour guide and the audio tour move him through at a brisk clip. At one point, the tour guide interrupts him taking a photo to tell him that this is the most photographed house in the country and he might better use his time doing something else. Halfway through the visit, he gives up on the audio tour. He already knows the history of the house. He just wants to spend time there, try to understand what that actually feels like. This too is a fantasy. The room is crowded. Skirting other visitors, he finds himself hugging walls, choosing moments to quickly cross the room as directly as he can. He is following the house's right-angled layout as if it were a script rather than a stage set, tracing rigid orthogonal paths like the ones on Eileen Gray's drawing. He thinks that this orthogonal anxiety is the result of time pressure. In house museums where a visitor can come and go as they please, he finds himself developing his own meandering paths. The Bachelor spent about 7 hours in John Soane's house, examining in detail the contours of its complicated plan and how they interact with its institutional framework, at times being gently corrected by its friendly army of volunteers when he pressed too hard on its edges. Responding to Le Corbusier's famous claim that a house is a machine for living, Eileen Gray said, "A house is not a machine to live in. It is the shell of man, his extension, his release, his spiritual emanation." More than an architect, Gray was an interior designer, but she seems to have conceived of an interiority deeper than the inside of a building. A fragile spiritual essence, which nevertheless has enough given integrity to emanate and take form as a shell, a house. For her, the exterior world was built around an interior which she presumed to be stable and pre-existing. The Bachelor doesn't think it's possible for his interior to emanate across a landscape, or a blank site, and take on a domestic architectural form. It's not something that's already there, not a resource. It is only formed or constituted by boundaries, by its contact with an exterior. The Bachelor Pad is pulled into shape by the exterior world, but not with any apparent grand intention. Neither the exterior nor the interior could really be said to have been designed. They were determined by the shape of the surrounding city, its infrastructure, its existing operational geometry. Iteratively, day by day, his interiority forms in dialogue with his rented flat's interior. One makes shuffling advances into the other, which feeds back into it, and so on. When the Bachelor was first shown around the flat, he fell in love with it almost at once, but not because he thought, now here is my emanation, here is the place where what is inside me can come out. He loved it because he recognised it as a place that could press in on him in interesting ways, that could change the shape of his interior and squeeze something new out of it. Like any institution, a museum has complex internal workings. There are organisational structures, funding plans, hiring practices, staff guidelines, disciplinary measures, the social dynamics resulting from these mechanics, all the disputes, justified grievances and petty resentments which hierarchies produce, express themselves on the surface of the museum, through its most public-facing employees, as something like a personality. Of course, this personality is capable of dissonance, and of pushing back in on the internal workings. Through observing the gestures of tour guides, security guards, and ticket staff, the Bachelor begins to draw conclusions about the condition of the institution. From his simple surface interactions, he believes he can tell how these workers are treated, how much they cared about their jobs to begin with, and how much the machine has subsequently worn them down. A gesture can show love and care for the building one works in and with. It can demonstrate exhaustion, irritation, disinterest. Some endlessly repeated gestures are repeated through joy, a tour guide miming lifting the top of a table she's not allowed to touch, but gets a kind of erotic withholding thrill from moving just beside. Other repeated gestures express the rhythm of wage drudgery. They break time into how many sales exchanges will I have in the next hour? How long will it take for that guy to walk over and ask me where the bathroom is?
Take it away. Watch the door, please. Blasting off. Watch your step. And watch your hands, Mr. Kirkby.
I beg your pardon?
One of these days, I'm going to shut these doors on you and... 20 next.
Boy, would I like to get her on a slow elevator to China.
She's the best operator in the building.
Yeah, well, I'm a pretty good operator myself.
In the John Soane Museum, the Bachelor fell briefly in love with a woman who sold him an information booklet. As she talked to him, she smiled and laughed and bobbed up and down eccentrically on the balls of her feet. She was charming mostly because it was her job to make him pay £1 for something that in most museums would be free. This pound essentially takes the place of an admission fee, since Soane passed a special act of Parliament ensuring his house would always be free and open to the public. A deep institutional peculiarity has ripples which show on the surface, with the Bachelor attempting to flirt with this woman. Despite him knowing what the service industry demands, he still cannot help but interpret her friendly charm as flirting back. He is incorrigible. The Bachelor is never not falling briefly in love. Everywhere he goes and at all times, he has his eyes open for ways to shed his bachelor status, to worm his way into the domestic dream whose material form he is supposed to be critically studying. If it was once a machine for living, the modernist house is now a propaganda machine. Its superficial operator is the tour guide or the seller of tickets or information booklets, but their gestures combine and overlap with many others. The fidgeting of a bored child, the gesticulations of their determined parent, the frantic scribbling of the architecture student, the constant and automatic lifting of the tourist's camera. The Bachelor vectoring randomly through the house, eyes peeled for more crumbs of the heterosexual monogamous dream for him to consume. The Bachelor's thumbs moving in the dark night when he wakes up and emails these thoughts to himself so that he won't forget them by the morning. His eyes darting as he lies sleepless and alone in his great white bed, thinking about how with their small gestures all of them collaboratively suspend this idea of home, of what once was or could have been home. Suddenly he can no longer tell one house museum from another, can't tell any single institution from the one that he feels is all around him, touching everything and shaping his desires. There is no one operator, no one operation in the working of the machine. The machine is an assembly line, producing preserved and projected distillations of life. All of the frantic movements along the line, compelled by desire or love or the need to survive, are iterations of something bigger that he can't quite zoom out far enough to see. As his thumbs slide in the darkness across the cracked and glowing screen of his phone, the machine of monogamous modernism is rattling away, reproducing itself. It's clear from Le Corbusier's remark about a machine for living that he understood occupying a house as a form of labour. One's life is produced by the machine, but one must also keep the machine running. One both operates and is dragged through the machine. The Bachelor can't help but think about how the tasks involved in this operation are distributed according to capitalist wage-labour relations. The role Le Corbusier allowed for machines was the conditioning of the human spirit, going on to claim that art has no business resembling a machine, the error of constructivism. Corbusier rejected constructivism's joyful cyborgs, its integration of machine and operator. He had a pinched reactionary disdain for any collapse of boundaries between art and life, human and machine. In his writing, he frequently invoked a vague and not entirely coherent vision of the human spirit, an outdoorsy, sun-worshipping entity who is simultaneously thoroughly urban and rational. The modernist machine house purports to provide the hygienic environment in which this spirit could flourish. Eileen Gray, accepting the same spiritualist model of subjectivity, nevertheless dryly dismissed what she called hygiene one could die of. Of course, such a notion of hygiene is only conceivable when the homeowner doesn't do any of the dirty work. The design of the machine divided its tasks according to existing class relations. This is most clearly seen in the Villa La Roche. The house was designed for an unmarried art collector and a single live-in servant. Its layout is relatively generous to both of them. Indeed, it is the only house museum the Bachelor visited in which the servants' quarters offer anything close to the quality of life he himself enjoys. But the paths and domains of homeowner and servant remain strictly separated, and their tasks are understood as diametrically opposed. La Roche's job was a kind of performative intellectual labour, to give the house meaning by sitting in a chair looking at a painting on an otherwise blank wall, or to guide visitors through Corbusier's intended architectural promenade. The servant's job was to lubricate and maintain the machinery that produced the spirit, which one must assume was proper to La Roche. It's not clear whether the servant in the Corbusian scheme is a manifestation of the human spirit or part of the machinery that conditions it. Le Corbusier coined the term human limb object to denote a very large class of items, from chairs to filing cabinets to typewriters. Anything which he saw as having a broadly prosthetic relation to the body, which helped the human spirit avoid unpleasant tasks, accidents, the sterile drudgery, and give it the freedom to think about something, about art, for example. Tellingly, he elaborates, "The human limb object is a docile servant. A good servant is discreet and self-effacing in order to leave his master free." Eileen Gray, explaining in passing the purpose of the small room in the lower ground floor of E1027, calls it the smallest habitable cell, and says it could serve as a model for any child's or servant's room, wherever the indispensable is sufficient. Both of these statements rest upon assumptions about people employed as servants that deny them agency, or even consciousness. It seems impossible for Gray to imagine the kind of elevated life she was designing for being expandable to all people. Consequently, it was necessary to imagine that some people simply didn't have the expansive and complicated emotional and aesthetic needs the rest of the house existed to accommodate. These modernist houses rely on rhetoric relegating certain classes of people to subhuman levels of consciousness and affectivity. Wherever the human spirit was being freed, wherever the question of the good life was tabled, they insisted on setting aside a small space for those who would support it but not take part. In the weird apartment he lived in until the end of his life, the maid had to go outside altogether to get from her bedroom to the kitchen, so as not to disturb the flow of life in the part of the house occupied by Le Corbusier and his wife Yvonne. For her part, Yvonne was not allowed to enter the studio, which occupied about half the footprint of the house. While it's easy to imagine joyful complicity between these women while the man of the house was away, history is not suited to recording it. Both architects' statements are also pretty obnoxious in their assumptions about furniture and children. Perhaps the ubiquity of servants coloured their relationships to the world around them, but neither was able to conceive of a version of the good life that didn't rely on some inanimate, ever-present support, which they didn't have to expend too much mental energy on. The Bachelor is outraged at the suggestion that his furniture is his servant, that it is there to be entirely subject to his needs, or that it requires a master-servant paradigm to make sense. He thinks of furniture and appliances as housemates, awkward creatures with their own demands and their own autonomy, drawing their beauty and their poise from their awkward insistence on themselves. At least in this regard, Rietveld appears to agree with him, describing his zigzag, "A chair like that leaves the space undisturbed. It's like a small partition in the space. The space in front and behind remain. It's also a constructional joke. Not a chair, I've never called it a chair. It's the zigzag, and that's that." Because his skin responds badly to the sun, and he was reluctant to pay restaurant prices in the Monaco-adjacent Roquebrune Cap Martin, the Bachelor had to look for a shady outdoor spot to read his book in the morning hours before the guided tour of E1027 and the surrounding cluster of smaller Le Corbusier buildings. He scrambled through the shady forest slopes about 10 or 20 metres east of the fence enclosing the modernist compound. Watching the ground for a comfortable-looking patch with a view to the sea, he discovered the remains of a homeless person's camp. An old sleeping mat, some clothes, bottles of medicine, and tubes of toothpaste. It was hard to tell if it was one person or more. It didn't look like anyone had been there recently. Maybe they were discovered and moved on. The area was full of signs driving home the presence of CCTV, each bearing the logo of Cap Moderne, the non-profit association tasked with managing the site. The Bachelor tried to clear the branches, but there was no way to get a line of sight to the house from the little hollow where the dusty clothes were gathered. He hung around for a while, not sure what to do, not sure how to process the knowledge that in the recent past people lived under bushes just out of sight of an empty monument to a luxurious future. During the 1990s, E1027 was squatted. Many writers mentioned this in passing when giving a rundown of the building's pre-renovation fortunes, but no one treats it as a serious part of its history. What is it possible to do with this knowledge? How can it be reconciled with the vast knowledge that has been generated and accumulated around this house? Could its integration change the meaning of the whole? Is it possible to build a new future out of recycled material? There is something specific to how the Bachelor arranges his loneliness when travelling. He visits the fanciest houses in Europe and stays in hostels, in 10-bed dorms. He sets up situations in which he's constantly public. All of these trips to visit and study how people have historically tried to live have been marked by his not being sure how to live, how to conduct himself in the course of living a day. When he visited Utrecht, he didn't even stay the night, and yet this still happened. He made an unnecessarily enormous deal out of going into a cafe to write his thoughts down. He stood outside for a long time, peering in through the window, trying to scope out if it was the right place. Once home, he stares into the bathroom mirror for an incredible period of time and collects himself. He sees a straight white man falling apart and tries to pull it together. He tends to the points of disintegration in the boundaries of himself, applies ointment to the cracks. He enjoys the quiet and the space. He wanks. He consumes and critiques cultural productions and artifacts. He reads. He indulges his sexuality and his other appetites. He connects, in a limited way, to other subjects. Through this connection, he collects material to shore up and re-establish his boundaries. The Bachelor is a man living among his collection of futures. He lives alone for the time being. For him, living alone is by its very nature an anticipation of kinship. He lives with images and ideas of how people might live together. Who exactly these people are remains abstract. The Bachelor wishes to investigate how life might be lived, how the physical structures around life are built for certain social forms, how building different structures might allow for the living of different lives. He studies how people 100 years ago tried to physically articulate answers to these questions. Everywhere he goes, he finds the relics of bourgeois families living in airy houses, with damp, crumbling walls and cramped rooms for servants. He feels outrage. He feels sick. Sometimes he feels joy. Sometimes during his travels, he thinks he is maybe getting a little bit better at being on his own. He doesn't find any answers. The Bachelor is stuck in a loop. A song is stuck in his head. As he walks around these houses, the neurons in his brain conjure John Lennon's voice, drifting around and around. Love is the answer, and you know that for sure. He doesn't believe in his research. On a guttural, intuitive level, he believes he already knows the answer to his questions. Sometimes John Lennon's voice slides into Jimmy Durant's. Love is the answer. Someone to love is the answer. Once you've found her, build your world around her. The Bachelor is disintegrating, a disintegrating cultural form. It's no longer weird to be single long into adulthood. There is no longer a sense of finality around relationships, no longer a solid cultural assumption of marriage as the end goal of a life. Why is he so tormented? Why does he want so badly to tear himself entirely apart and rebuild himself around someone else? The Bachelor is an artifact of an earlier time. He has always been a 21st century man defined by a 20th century paradigm of desire. He first appeared as an image of the future. In the English-speaking world, the term Bachelor Pad seems to have been popularised in the pages of high-end mid-20th century men's magazines, like Playboy and Esquire. There it signified a high-tech urban apartment where a young male professional could unwind and entertain. The Bachelor Pad was a space where the established boundaries between public and private were questioned. The goal of the magazines was to prize apart the binary image of a complementary man as producer and woman as consumer, to construct the new producing and consuming subject of the single urban man. However, the term entered the Bachelor's collection with another, shabbier signification: the dark, messy burrow of a gross single man. A man who refuses to care for himself or to cast himself as a homemaker. This man is the product of a cheapening of the consumer electronics of the 1960s, the erosion of their glamour, their break with the aesthetics of high design. He is a man whose life is built around online forums, empty beer bottles, and video games on 4K television screens. Both kinds of bachelor are at some stage supposed to be rescued from their glamour or their squalor by the steadying influence of a good woman. They are supposed to get a sensible job and a sensible set of children. Countless cinematic and televisual narratives, from Frankenstein to New Girl, stage the resolution of this scene, the transformation of an unhinged young man into a productive and reproductive member of society. The failure of real life to deliver on this promise of resolution unleashes waves of misogynistic violence in many young men, who blame women for not saving them from themselves. Their rage is a byproduct of the machine for living. It distracts them from the possibility that they could become part of a broad coalition to dismantle the machine. As a figure of pure possibility, the Bachelor represents the future of patriarchy, but he also represents a threat to the proper functioning of the reproduction of class and gender relations. If he lingers too long in whatever compromised self-sufficiency he develops, he may end up refusing altogether to submit to the heteromonogamous logic which his benevolent forefathers provided for him. He is the monstrous muck that the dominant order must mould into a man, and if his passions are diverted, he can quickly become a site of wasted potential. Now, the Bachelor must think of how this wasted potential can be put to non-violent ends. What would the disintegration of the Bachelor mean? What would happen if his boundaries collapsed and he forgot the deadening desires he has been taught by modernism and mass culture sitcoms and the memory of dead men's magazines? What if he could stop thinking of how he lives now as nothing but a preamble to something else? Under patriarchy, the Bachelor is defined by being always already thrust into a predetermined future. He is thus thrust by both outside pressure and his own desires. He is a restless producer-consumer, with all his production and all his consumption bent towards the furious end of marriage. He is obsessed by it. It occupies all his thoughts, every waking hour, and oh God, his dreams. He is the death throes of a cultural form. The Bachelor's disintegration would mean accepting himself as the Bachelor. By dwelling pleasurably, permanently, in possibility. Maybe love isn't the answer. Maybe love is the question.